Let's recap a bit. We've tried to lay out the problem of drug violence in Mexico and asked what is happening in this country. We've tried to give a brief sketch of some major watersheds, important moments in Mexican history. We've also asked whether or not Mexico can be considered a failed state. We've said no. A criminal insurgency is a better way to understand what is happening in Mexico. So, to begin tackling some of these questions, we need a bit more context, a bit more detail. First, it's important to reiterate that Mexico's drug violence has not spread to all locations in the country equally. According to one Mexican scholar, Roderick Camp, who has compiled some data on where the violence is taking place, we can give a bit more accurate detail. As of 2010, the Mexican government provided some information on the geographical spread of violence in the nation. The official stats you should always take with a grain of salt, but they are very telling. 80% of the murders that took place since 2006 to 2010 happened in just 6% of Mexico's 2,456 municipalities. So the violence has been focused in very important places, right? And those places are oftentimes on the border. The data also indicated a breakdown by state of where the violence had taken place. Chihuahua, 30%, that's where Ciudad Juarez is. Sinaloa, 13%, that's the capital where Culiacan, where a lot of drug trade started. Baja California, Tijuana, Michoacan, Tamaulipas, and Nuevo Leon. So it's no surprise that Sinaloa has the second highest percentage of murders. The capital city, Sinaloa, Culiacan, has the second highest murder rate since 2006 after Ciudad Juarez. Sinaloa, in fact, is ground zero in Mexican drug trafficking. It's the location that started it all. So in this video, we want to look at the context of Sinaloa and how the culture of drug growing and drug selling got started there. It's a history closely related to globalization, poverty, and the opportunities of worldwide markets. In the pre-Columbian or indigenous era and the colonial era, in Sinaloa, as pointed out by Grillo, at the time of the Spanish conquest, the territory now known as Sinaloa lay outside the Aztec orbit of domination. It was on the frontier of the Aztec Empire. After the Spanish arrived, it continued to be on the edge of colonial rule. This was mostly due to geography. Sinaloa's topography is mountainous. There's lots of mountains. There is a narrow strip of western coastal land, but the area is dominated by the Sierra Madre Occidental on the east. By independence time, the 1810s, Sinaloa was the site of contraband smuggling of weapons and illegal silver brought in from China. The late colonial period brought ships from Asia to Mexico's west coast, where a burgeoning shipping trade began. In the era of the Porfiriato, after independence, Sinaloans, especially the Yaqui Indians, resisted assimilation into society. President Porfirio Diaz sought to violently coerce the tribe through bloodshed, disease, and starvation until they were finally pacified. Diaz also sought to modernize the country. He built railroads, he increased the mining output, and pushing Mexico into the industrial age. Sinaloa was a good place, at least in the plains, for growing wheat and other agricultural products. During the Porfiriato, Sinaloa began to increase in its agricultural infrastructure. All of this development meant that cheap labor was needed. Chinese workers arrived on steamships in Sinaloa after the 1860s, and by the 1880s, opium had been charted by government reports. In another lecture, we'll look at the rise of opium, but suffice it to say, the British Empire was the first drug cartel in the modern world, and had forced opium on China. Millions of Chinese peasants got hooked on this stuff, and wars were fought over the trade and prohibition of the substance. And so when Chinese workers arrived in Sinaloa, they arrived with their opium. At the same time, the agricultural and transportation networks for trade in opium to be successful had already been developed by the Porfirian modernization programs. Consumption and transport of drugs are often encouraged by wars. Opium had been known to society since ancient times, but it wasn't until the early 1800s that scientists were able to refine the substance into morphine. And morphine was, as an important painkiller, would be important to fighting wars. In the 1840s, Mexicans and Americans both smoked marijuana during the Mexican-American War. At the time, marijuana was legal in both countries. War also contributed to the perfection of methods to distribute morphine. In 1858, two surgeons in America used a hypodermic needle for the first time to inject morphine into the bloodstream. Morphine became a wonder drug of sorts when it could be found during the Civil War. It covered everything from pain and some surgeries to malaria and dysentery. By the 1880s, pharmacies were giving out morphine and other drugs over the counter, completely legally. The pharmaceutical company Merck used cocaine as a surgical anesthetic. Sears and Roebuck catalogs even marketed morphine-laced mixtures to add into the coffee of wayward spouses to keep them from going out at night. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, wrote a famous scientific paper called On Cocaine, which he said could be used to prescribe to people for so-called nervous disorders. He himself was a huge user of cocaine. He even used cocaine on himself to treat his own morphine addiction. When the state of Georgia in the United States introduced a law against selling and consuming alcohol in 1885, Dr. John Pemberton invented Coca-Cola. It was non-alcoholic, sure, but it was flavored with the cola nut, which provided caffeine, and it was also, at first, laced with cocaine. In 1898, the Bayer Company in Germany, as in the pain reliever that is still sold today, introduced a so-called non-addictive cough suppressant for children, yet it was basically heroin. They called it heroish because it made one heroic after using it. And so even in the late 19th century, a demand for certain narcotics legal at the time helped develop the opium and later heroin industry in Sinaloa. And so it should be noted again that the drug trade in Mexico and the infrastructure for drugs in Mexico, which began in Sinaloa, really got its start within a context of a legal drug market. Chinese immigrants had brought the stuff with them, especially as immigration increased after natural disasters in San Francisco diverted them farther south. The US and Chinese governments did seek to curtail the bilateral of trade in opium and heroin after 1906, but by then Sinaloa and Mexico, where it was not illegal, continued to fill the demand for the stuff. The Sinaloans that grew opium poppies were called gummers or gomeros because the substance looked like gum that came from the poppies. In Sinaloa, this created the so-called golden triangle of drug-producing region in Sinaloa. So how did these peasants go from peasants to drug lords? The major shift in opium production for Sinaloa took place during World War II. That was a total war. The United States was sending troops to Europe, Africa, and Asia, but the whole U.S. industrial complex went into high gear manufacturing planes, weapons, munitions, uniforms, etc. But there was a problem. When troops at the front were injured, one of the best ways to immediately treat them, or at least ease their suffering before they died, was to give them morphine. The problem was that the major supplier of opium, from where the morphine was taken, originated in Asia. But the war had cut off the major trade routes to Asia. So the U.S. looked especially to Mexico, Sinaloan opium, to supply morphine to the troops. It was just one of the many products that the U.S. needed from Latin America. There were others, such as rubber from the Amazon, harvested in great number to supply the war effort. The trade for Asian rubber had also been cut off. And so Sinaloan gomeros, many peasants from the mountainous regions of western Mexico, began to supply the war effort. And they got enriched by doing so. The infrastructure of the trade in heroin was built especially after World War II. It was a family business. Culiacan, the capital, began to benefit as a result in increased infrastructure and building projects. And it's important to note that World War II marked the rise in Sinaloan drug trafficking. And it was a business that would give rise to drug trafficking in the rest of Mexico. The most influential drug lords of the late 20th century all came from Sinaloa. In summary, Mexico's drug trade developed in tandem with a global market demand for pharmaceutical narcotics, as well as with patterns of conflict that affected the globe due to total war. Moreover, Sinaloan drug trafficking was the first major organized narcotics network in Mexico, and this region has given rise to the majority of cartel organizations to date. Cartel wars in Mexico are at some level local Sinaloan infighting for control of lucrative plazas. That's all I have for you today. See you next time.